just like to welcome everyone to the next edition of the AeroPM Learning Together program. Today we've got Nick Gover with us. Nick is an ex-Army aerospace engineer. He's been with AeroPM now for 18 months. He's currently working on the Land 154 program, which I'm sure he may go into a small amount of detail in during the discussion today. So thank you all very much for tuning in to this latest edition. And I wish Nick the best of luck in the presentation, and he'll talk to you all about it. Over to you, Nick.
Thanks, Adam. Good day, everyone. Nick Gover, as Adam mentioned, spent a bunch of years in Army aero engineering, a couple of different helicopter types, but now find myself doing counter-IED acquisition, which is slightly different and under a completely different regulatory framework. So while I'm not the expert on this, the whole purpose of this meeting is to get people talking and have a think about the different sort of nuances to achieving due diligence and, or maybe, seeking that golden egg. So these are the things we're going to talk about today. What is due diligence? We'll talk about integrating different systems and the outcomes of doing that under different reg frameworks. Then we'll look at some examples under those three domains there, the air. I've combined the joint and land domains. And then we'll talk a little bit about cyber, which is a bit emerging, and then we'll kind of wrap up. Sort of to contextualise this, I suppose, this necessarily is a bit of a defence-centric presentation. It's got defence flavour to it. The examples that I'm going to talk about are quite sort of Army-centric because that's my background. But the theory and the methodology behind achieving due diligence and chasing due diligence is broadly applicable across a range of domains. So one thing, if you do have a question or a point or something you want to raise or discuss, please speak up. I don't hold a monopoly on good ideas. So I'm completely all ears. This is a learning together session. So moving forward, what's due diligence? Due diligence is knowing enough or knowing the right amount for the task you're doing. And the subjective section is that in there is knowing enough. What is enough? Well, enough is applying reasonable care. It's applying requisite effort. But part of your obligations as a professional, particularly for the engineers out there, it's finding the right technical knowledge to apply to a situation. Due diligence or appropriate rigor isn't applying all of the rigor. It's finding out what that right amount is and applying that. So I've quoted a cracking ISO 31,000 quote. It's got a bunch of principles in that standard. Seek it out at your own leisure. But it talks about the best available information. So it's up to the individual, for whatever problem you're trying to solve, to go and source that available information. I suppose the question we're all here today to kind of flesh out is, how do I know when I've done enough? I'm sorry, I'm not here to give anyone any golden eggs. I'm not going to give you a panacea to all your problems. How do you know when you've done enough? Well, you probably won't. You probably will only know that you haven't done enough when something goes wrong, and that's the crux here. What you want to be able to do is provide form a credible, defensible argument and position behind whatever decision making, be it project, financial, or engineering, that you need to go down into. So, due diligence is by nature iterative. It's cyclic. You can't naturally form a final position. So if you can't find a final position, then it's quite difficult to find a start point. So this cycle that I've presented here is kind of an amalgamation of a bunch of standards and a few different policies from within defence. But the main thing I wanted to highlight here is that it is cyclical. So as a relatively arbitrary starting point, we'll pick on the left-hand side there, audit. So in practicality, what you might find is an audit or some sort of review of your project or system is being conducted, and finds a bunch of problems. So you'll then establish the management systems as a result of that audit, or that'll be one of the recommendations. From those management systems, you'll then identify some risks. You'll then build those into the system, identify some mitigations. Then you find your way back around to auditing that system, and you'll continue to grow and evolve your problem-solving ability as you go through the system. The key thing to remember here is that your context is changing throughout. So particularly like when you're looking at different risks, the natural life cycle of any sort of project or process says that the risks are going to change. So you need to continually analyse those risks. You're continually analysing the configuration, the role and the environment of any system that you're operating in to make sure that you're still hitting that target. And at each step, when the context changes, the standard of due diligence necessarily changes with it. Funnily enough, that sort of cycle of conducting any sort of system looks a hell of a lot like the Plan, Do, Check, Act system. Straight out of yet another ISO, and this is OH&S management. For me, this kind of ties due diligence back. One of the roots of due diligence is, in Australia at least, proving that you are compliant with the requirements and the intent of the WHS Act. So if you are seen to be iterating a quality management system or some sort of management system that is iterative and learns as it grows, then you can argue compliance with those sort of standards. And the Plan, Do, Check, Act system, I mean, it's not just isolated to WHS, it's throughout a range of different systems, and just iterates highlights the iterative nature of any continual development process. So as a bit of an example, I said this will have a somewhat army flavour to it. We're going to talk about the integration of systems, and as such, like the way that different systems ping together to develop a capability and to deliver a capability. The highlighted text there down the bottom says that capability only comes from integrated systems, and yeah, it's a bit of a NAF system, but it's something. Sorry, a bit of a NAF definition, but it's something to keep in mind when you're looking at these different reg frameworks. So again, I have defence and army eyes to this. If any of these acronyms don't make sense, please stick your hand up and we can talk it through. So the effect on the battlefield is necessarily the soldier down the bottom, but the soldier is relatively useless without some supporting fires. So he's got some big armoured units above him that are helping him assist with his mission and doing the stuff that he can't do. And above that, we've got some helicopters there that are providing logistics, overwatch, firepower support where required, and you can extend that to our RAF and Navy brethren as well. But all of these things have to come together to deliver an effect on the battlefield, and they have to be supported through life and introduced into service in pretty similar ways. And as we do that introduction to service and through life support, there's a myriad of different responsibilities, artifacts, authorities that you have to deal with to achieve that. So I'll work from the top down this time. The aviation world's kind of amalgamated its regulations into something that aligns better with international and civil regulation frameworks, the Defence Aviation Safety Regulation, which at the top is a single basic regulation that says you must operate aircraft in a safe way, having been brought into service in another safe way, and designed in a safe way. And then it's up to the military air operators to determine the risk tolerances in their individual operations. But in order to bring the airframe in, we've got a raft of different regs that we need to adhere to. You've got your 21J and G at the start. that brings your aircraft into service. And then you've got continuing airworthiness through DAS-RM to deal with. You've also got your DAS-R 145 organisations who are going to operate it, your licensing schemes under 66, all the training requirements that goes into aircrew and your maintenance personnel. Then we've got all the ancillary stuff that we want to attach to the aircraft, roll equipment, internal, external, how are we going to deliver aerial delivery, something like that's in the picture there. How do we deliver that safely? How do we certify that? And slightly inconveniently, all these different inputs to this single capability have a range of different acceptance criteria and authorities that sign off on this. And hence we've established a range of different frameworks in which to apply due diligence to that to satisfy those authorities that we've met their obligations under the WHS Act. Ultimately, the WHS Act places onus on a single individual, the accountable person, to meet their obligations. So a lot of the DAS-R regs lean themselves towards that, to providing a framework for that person to say that they have applied due diligence in establishing their system. I'll take a breath and then have a look at the two pieces of land material at the bottom, our tank and our soldier. In the land framework, we operate with Design Acceptance Authority Representatives, or DARs, and based on the system or the through life support framework around that, largely determines who's going to be responsible for bringing that equipment into service and signing off on behalf of the Commonwealth that it's ready for action. So as a bit of just a thought provoker, in those two, well, in the single system down the bottom, the soldier, we can count 6 different DARs who are going to have to sign off on him getting ready to present a capability. And that's not the end of it. For the tank, there's about 14 from memory. For the counter-IED systems that we're working with, there's at least 4 involved. And then these DARs aren't isolated. They are interwoven with each other, but the way that they achieve their due diligence is by issuing engineering management systems that the rest of the engineering framework below them works under. And not only do we have the DARs and all the accountable people from the DAS-R world, across defence we have executive authorities who are then responsible for the expenditure of finance. So they need to be assured through their own due diligence processes that the systems that they're receiving are financially sound and meet their obligations under the Commonwealth procurement rules to deliver a capability. So whilst this is a very technical centric discussion, we can't isolate ourselves from the fact that that finance plays a role in it as well. So now that I've sort of fleshed out a little bit of the different frameworks, regulations and authorities representative in a relatively simple little system, I've looked at the capability life cycle, and for the pedants out there, I acknowledge that we're now going down the product life cycle route. However, the tenets behind the capability life cycle are still pretty applicable. So I have kind of taken the old CLC manual and the intent of product lifecycle management and amalgamated them into a pretty sort of generic life cycle. So there's 4 phases to the life cycle: the requirements definition phase, where you look at what the customer need is and how we're going to meet that, and then you start to work on your V diagram. The acquisition phase, where we're going to go out and actually acquire the piece of equipment, adhering to a bunch of due diligence rules in making sure that it's safe and fit for purpose. The in-service part of the life cycle, so ensuring that it remains safe and fit for purpose, and that's kind of the DAS-RM/145 equivalency there. And then at the end of the life, we're going to dispose of it. And how do we make sure that we're disposing of that in a safe way, but also in a way that is in the best interests of the customer, that we're still going to ensure they have capability throughout. So I'm just going to split some examples through here of the different things you might want to think about in achieving due diligence at the different phases of the life cycle. So firstly, the requirements phase. Have we engaged everyone that we need to? Have we talked to the right people about the right things? How do we ensure that the different stakeholders are providing genuine advice and are staying inside their lane? It's quite difficult to ensure that the messages that you hear from stakeholders are actually abound in truth and not sort of wishful thinking. I think everyone's had some sort of examples through their career where a list of requirements comes through in the form of a shopping list, and the delivery agency gets tasked with going out and buying a whole bunch of fancy stuff, and then later on in the life cycle works hard on remediating that fancy stuff into some sort of proper introduction to service. So in line with that, once we've got the what we say are the stakeholder needs, how do we devolve those into requirements? How do you apply the rationale behind requirements? Clear, concise, traceable, singular, all those tenets. How do we ensure that those are sufficient to do the job, and how do we know that we've gone down the right rabbit holes to the right depth? The points 2 and 3 there, some classic V&V work. But are our requirements verifiable by who? Does that agency know that they're going to be able to do this? Have we engaged with them? Are they expecting it? Are we going to blindside them? And are the requirements actually achievable? Again, I'm sure everyone's experienced pie in the sky thinking around capability. And in line with identifying stakeholders, in this very early stage, we need to identify who our certification and validation authorities are, and in what context of our product they work. In the previous example, we saw that the aircraft has got a bunch of different stakeholders that are going to sign off on different items within that certification process. So we need to engage early and ensure that they are ready and able to undertake that work, even when we need it. During the acquisition phase, the first point there talks about one I've already kind of mentioned, the financial and commercial implications. Although we're here talking about technical due diligence, it's remiss to not think about the financial implications of the decisions you're making, and getting aligned by project and program managers when you're stepping outside the bounds. Or when you think you're applying technical due diligence, but in their eyes, you are chasing ground aggressively in order to solve a technical problem that they may not have the financial risk appetite to take on. So there's that two-way dialogue between your engineers and your project managers, and sometimes that ends up being a one-way dialogue with your project manager at your systems engineers, but that's why they're the project managers. So the other things we need to look at during acquisition are we being ambitious? Can what we've actually written be fulfilled? Our delivery agency or our system integrator or our OEM, do they have the technical nous, systems and pedigree to deliver the system that we're asking them to deliver? This is an important technical risk conversation to have with the project manager. So while the project manager is focused on schedule and money, the technical people need to be injecting in there and saying and communicating technical risk to the PM, so that they don't head down the reverse rabbit hole of spending money and getting really fast schedule, but zero technical capability. How do we ensure that, this kind of links into the previous point, but how do we ensure that all our design reviews are achieved and achievable? And if not, how do we rectify it? What are our plans for gaining ground technically if we get through some sort of configuration audit and find a bunch of errors? What are our EMS and quality management system and engineering management system certifications? Do we require them? Do we require our prime system integrator or a prime vendor to hold these certifications? What's the risk tolerance there? Sometimes it's extremely important to have a ISO 31000 quality management system signed off, seen and maintained, but other times it's just not worth, the juice isn't worth the squeeze in achieving that. So within the ASDEFCON world anyway, it's important to know where those responsibilities lie and what the risk profile is of your project. And we'll talk about risk profiles in land versus aviation a bit more later. Performance-based contracting I've highlighted there just as a prompt. Again, this ties back to the financial implications, and it's a financial risk mitigator. So if the engineering world isn't able to solve all the engineering problems, which we're largely, that's a bit ambitious to be able to do that. So we need to put in place risk mitigation strategies to achieve that, and sometimes that comes down to a financial hook in the contract. Same with liabilities and losses. There should be a backup, not something you're relying on up front, because if you're relying on liabilities and losses clauses within contracts, then your engineers and your financial people definitely haven't done their due diligence. And the support system. Is it sufficient through the in-service? So during in-service, you're going to hand that system off to a sustainment organisation. How do they ensure that? Well, so I'll step back a little bit. There's that transition point between acquisition and in-service, largely where it transitions. It might transition between project officers or you'll just have different sustainment and acquisition entities. So it's in everyone's interest to ensure that you get both parties to the table to talk about the problems, to highlight things, and to talk about any risk mitigation strategies you've come up to during your plan, do, check, act, to ensure that that continual improvement cycle is maintained. There's no use throwing dead cats over the fence. So things that we need to be able to communicate to the in-service people. Are there ongoing changes? How do we communicate those? Are they achievable within the in-service organisation's engineering management system and skills and competency frameworks? Configuration change is an interesting one. I'll just delve into that.
Hey, Nick, this is just Tim here. Can I just ask a question on what you were just going through, mate? You're talking about the responsibilities of managing that due diligence and the sustainment organisations. In the transition process, what responsibility does the acquisition organisation have to ensure that sustainment has the right procedures, policies? Like, you spoke about handing over anything we know, but we've handed over everything we know to a presumable organisation that is ready and able to continue providing that due diligence function going forward. Are we responsible for ensuring that they have the right qualifications, skill sets, processes in place?
Well, no, we're not responsible. We hold a responsibility for checking, I'll say checking that they hold a quality management system or an engineering management system to a certain standard. I think it's probably a bit of a risk call as to how far into those systems you delve to prove to yourself that those organisations that you're handing over to hold that sort of organisational structure and skills. And I think it's a tough one. You hold some responsibility, but at the same time, you need to be able to acknowledge that it's also that organisation's responsibility to hold those qualifications. And they're their hand if they don't. You'd hope that it doesn't get to a stage where you're handing over something into sustainment, only at the transition working group sort of point to find that they do not hold those sort of skills. You should have found that back way back in the requirements phase.
Nick, I suppose one approach, one aspect to help to talk through Tim's question is there are agreements in place. You've got the MAA, you've got the MSA. Both organisations, both the acquisition agency and the sustainment agency, have responsibilities. One in pushing product data systems across to the in-service agency, and one for the in-service agency to prepare themselves and be prepared accordingly to receive, but also not only support, but to thrive in the environment that they are going to support that system in. And that obviously a lot of the time, depending on the size of the acquisition, will come along with the transition team as well. So there's a lot of due diligence that each individual agency has responsibility for, and must also obviously understand what they're receiving and how to catch that product and service as well.
Yeah, there's a big chunk in financial due diligence and commercial due diligence about. So if I'm acquiring a company, I need to conduct my own due diligence to make sure that company, that entity that I'm about to take on, is financially sound and has all the things that make that company a company. I suppose there's some parallels to draw here too, that both sides need to ensure, the sustainment organisation needs to ensure that they have studied the system they're about to take on sufficiently that they know they can take it on. And the acquisition side similarly needs to study to a point, and that point is probably the MAA/MSA, that the sustainment organisation they're handing over to has the nous, has all the systems to do it, but that they are providing that organisation with those gaps, with the filler to those gaps if identified.
Right, thank you.
Thanks, Tim, but I have conveniently lost my place. I think I was up to about here talking about post-acceptance capability integration. And this is probably a hot topic at the moment for some stuff that I'm doing. It's not about just putting the blinkers on and delivering an extremely technically sound system that can't integrate with anything else. So forecasting what those other systems you think you're going to integrate with are, and the appropriate responsibilities of different organisations there. The last point there, what about capability failure? What happens if a capability fails? Does this necessarily mean that due diligence wasn't applied? And I'll probably just sort of leave that point there, but it's an interesting one to ponder. Does failure actually, does system failure actually mean that the system has failed, the backup systems have failed? And during disposal, there's a bunch of different things you need to consider as well. And these need to be sort of fleshed out in any disposal plan quite early on in the piece. But the obligations of the Commonwealth, again, this is a defence-centric presentation. How are you going to dispose of problematic items of supply? That's another technical problem. Any remediations of works and facilities, and also the remediation of the workforce. So if you're requiring a large, I'll pluck an aircraft system that's replacing another aircraft system, how do you ensure from an AIC perspective that you're going to continue to maintain the technical skills of your technical staff and engineers that are involved in large projects? So I've kind of here simplified airworthiness in 3 steps to try and look at how you apply due diligence here. The 3 stages in airworthiness, again, quite simplified, but speak up anyone, particularly the aviation people out there, if you've got different opinions, thoughts. And you've got your initial type certification and design, continued airworthiness achieved through your 21J, and then continued airworthiness ensured by your Part M organisation and sort of enacted by your 145s and 66s. Through that process, through those 3 top boxes, there are different artifacts that fall out of it that prove or go away to demonstrating that at each stage, due diligence has been provided. And that's achieved through your type certificate, your design organisation exposition, and then your continuing airworthiness management exposition. Similarly, your 145 organisations hold their maintenance org expositions as well, and that's where they demonstrate. So exactly what I've kind of demonstrated here. Different artifacts fall out at different points in the life cycle, and moreover, you have different responsibilities. Although we have the Defence Aviation Safety Authority, who's the ultimate authority, funnily enough, in airworthiness, they delegate out their authority at different levels, at your 21, your Part M, and your 145 levels, to people like your CAM and your 145 responsible managers, in order to assure that assure themselves that those different expositions are being applied correctly, and therefore they're meeting their obligations under the DASA reg set as well as under the WHS Act. An interesting, I think I talked about it earlier, but one of the key points about the WHS Act is that it appoints WHS responsibility to a single person, where authority can be delegated out, but responsibility cannot. So it's up to the individual to ensure that they've got those. I've got a little sidebar tidbit. Airbus Asia Pacific actually has quite a nice little publicly available due diligence policy. The hyperlink's there, so after this presentation, you'll be able to go away, click on that and read it. But essentially, this kind of mirrors the Plan, Do, Check Act that I talked about at the start. Quite wordy paragraphs. This is verbatim. But you'll see that the first 5 steps talk about acquiring information, ensuring that you comply, knowing what you should be complying with. And then step 6 is essentially that audit, that have we done enough? So going back and looking at the previous steps and ensuring that through that process, if you have learned something new, you apply that knowledge accurately. So again, it's an iterative step, but it's quite a nice structure to this policy, despite being a little wordy. In comparison to the air domain, the land and joint domain, I'll smash them together, have an inherently higher risk tolerance, and that is a bit of a broad statement. I'm sure there's exceptions to that. So whereas in the air world, there's quite a high risk profile and a high level of rigor is applied at all steps. In the land and joint domain, it's a bit more of a risk-based approach to applying due diligence. So the risk tolerance threshold will depend highly on the role and environment that operations are being carried out in. So similar to the aviation example, you have your initial design and material certification. That's when you are going through the requirements and acquisition phase, you're adhering to your SPO policies and procedures, but then the higher level CAS-G procedures when they don't exist. And a lot of the time in the land domain, each SPO won't have its own individual policies and procedures. So the engineering management systems that the SPOs hold generally refer up to the higher policy. And also the LMSM, which is the Land Material Safety Manual, is relatively recent, is very WHS Act compliant, and actually calls out individual sections from the Act to comply to, but it applies a risk-based methodology to applying due diligence to technical issues. In sustainment, it's pretty similar. You'd adhere first to the Land Material Safety Manual, and the SPO SOPs generally fall out of that. One new portion to me is ICT and cyber systems, and this is where I'm going to profess to not be an expert, but having an increasing exposure to these systems is showing me that you cannot and should not differentiate or distinguish too heavily your IT and your capability, be it a helicopter or a tank. So as I stated there, the ICT Tech Assurance Framework is the method by which ICT systems and networks are designed and regulated. CIOG holds that document, but it's enacted generally through service headquarters and then through the different project offices that leverage off that framework. The IRAP, the Information Security Registered Assessor Program, there's a lot of acronyms at the bottom there because this is acronym heavy, this one. The IRAP is sponsored by the Australian Signals Directorate, and that is ultimately the methodology behind which Defence and Army adhere to the ICT TAF. So this is an open source sort of whole of government approach to achieving security accreditation, but the design and the cyber worthiness of ICT systems is insured to be against the TAF and assured by IRAP assessors in the first instance. However, there's a whole raft of SMEs within CIOG. Depending on what sort of system you're looking to bring in, that will be the interface to that tech assurance framework. So kind of just like to throw it open there to see if anyone's got any more exposure to particularly cyber, because I think that's something that I know I could learn a lot on. And given that I'm getting crickets in response, I think everyone's probably at the same sort of knowledge base as me. Yeah, my experience at the moment though is it's very it's polyamorous to try and divorce ICT and cyber systems from hardware systems. It's seeing an increasing involvement of the LAN network integration system to new acquisitions as we do try and grip up this cyber realm and ensure that we're applying due diligence across that in order to achieve the regulation of the acceptance regulation of IT systems as well as those hardware systems. So we've reached the end. Due diligence is iterative. It doesn't stop and it can't stop. And trying to know when to stop is the subjective call that the professional needs to adhere to and find. And that last point there, due diligence ends when you can provide and argue a credible, defensible position when reaching your technical decisions. You need to realise that those technical decisions and that decision-making process are going to be an input to project manager decision-making. But if you can put your hand on your heart and say, I've applied all reasonable measures in a risk-based framework in order to achieve what I need to achieve within a sufficient time frame, with sufficient resources and sufficient knowledge, then I think you've applied due diligence. So I'll open the floor to questions.
I'll start him off, Nick. You spoke about failure earlier on today, and you know, failure comes out of a lot of different areas. Sometimes you're provided a project and an acquisition strategy that isn't, I suppose, standard or is prone to failure, or may potentially have you know, a very low level of success, and you need to work your way through that project. You know, C27, for example, was from the very beginning a very complex beast from an acquisition perspective, and a lot of due diligence was applied, but because of the pressures, you know, coming down from government to say this is the product you'll be buying, you know, I'm not saying it's a failure of a product in this acquisition. I'm just saying it was a very complex beast. How does this, from a project manager perspective or an engineering manager perspective, how do you reconcile in your mind going forward that your due diligence, I suppose, is you know, on the right track in that situation?
I think it comes back to applying a reasonable amount of knowledge with the resources at your disposal, sorry, and where you don't have the knowledge or resources, as an engineer, it's my responsibility to communicate that risk. So in those sort of instances where I think a maintenance framework or an acquisition framework is complex to the point of being burdensome, I need to be able to form a technical, credible, defensible position to communicate that we have a risk here. I can't solve this risk. Here are the steps I think we need to take. But due diligence doesn't mean solving a problem. It means taking all reasonable steps to at least scope the problem so that you can communicate that. And I think that's kind of the interface between systems engineering and project management. There's a fair bit of overlap there. And it's all about risk, and engineers and project managers have different risk thresholds and different risk profiles, but the common communication or common language between the two is risk. So if you can communicate what you think the risk is, how you think you could solve it, and your known unknowns, I think you're in more of a credible, defensible place.
If you don't mind, I'll ask a follow-on question, and that is, you spend a lot of time in uniform, and now you're in the consulting world, providing advice and guidance. How has your mentality had to shift from being a uniform to being a consultant when providing due diligence, if it has?
Well, I just expect everyone to continue to follow me and do whatever the hell I say, really. No, it doesn't work like that. As a consultant, I'm there to do what the client requires. Not carte blanche, do whatever they tell me. But I'm in that workplace to provide subject matter expertise on a range of different things. So the way I demonstrate due diligence to them, it necessarily has to be a little bit softer, but I think it also makes you study your systems under a different light. You're not as focused on capability use as far as delivering and implementing capability. So the due diligence you apply, you're actually able to, I think, apply a little bit more and a little bit more as a not a non-interested third party, but a neutral third party. So I think consultants generally have a better neutral ground to form their decision making on. Of course, you're always going to get the capability manager who wants newer stuff delivered faster under better conditions, that does all sorts of fancy stuff. And the technical aspect there is to communicate the technical risks generally through the project manager to ensure that our uniformed people have the capability they need in a safe manner. And safety is probably the bit it comes down to. If you can communicate to the capability manager that what you're doing is safe and what they want to do is unsafe, that's generally a good starting point.
So I suppose under the old TA Reg framework, where the chief engineer was not necessarily in the chain of command of the operator or the owner of the aircraft, allows a consultant similar freedoms to make to provide their positions without impact of poor PARs or other activities. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think so. You kind of step outside that loop and you can see the forest from the trees a little bit. However, I know that for our CAMs, they're generally uniform members, so I think they're in a difficult position where they need to apply a lot of due diligence and ensure that the frameworks around them are supporting them, but they are also still uniformed people and people and accountable people under the WHS Act. So it's easy for consultants, but there are still a raft of examples out there where uniformed people are prone to a bunch of different influences that are different to us, and it's important for us to understand that.
All right. Thanks, Nick. Hopefully some more questions might come your way shortly.
Nick, I've got a question for you. It's Emily. Can you hear me?
Okay.
Cool. Awesome. My question is, I guess I'm interested in your experience for how due diligence is applied between the land and the aviation. And I think you touched on it there, but from my experience, because I've worked under both sets of TA regs, and I found that when I was in the aviation space, there was a lot of emphasis on airworthiness and safety. And when I moved to the land space, there was still a lot of emphasis on safety, but there was also the capacity to more holistically consider capability effect without sort of all the engineering resources being subsumed on the aviation and safety aspects. Does this correlate with your experience?
100%. I suppose it's necessary though. If a vehicle breaks down, it can pull over and get fixed. If a radio breaks, then you send it away, then you fix it and send it away and get it fixed. Something relatively minor goes wrong with an aircraft, it can put a capability to a grinding halt. So there is, I won't say less of an emphasis on safety, but it's more that all of the engineering rigor isn't thrown at providing a safe system, because there are mitigations to safety, and from a capability aspect too. There are multiple ways to deliver the same effect on the battlefield. So the way the capability manager, apologies for speaking a bit of army language, but it's a bit of the capability manager wants to have an effect, and they can achieve that effect through a range of different ways. It doesn't need to, if one system falls over for some sort of technical reason, safety or not, they've still got ways of achieving what they need to achieve. So the risk profile between the two is necessarily different. And from what I understand, the maritime environment sits somewhere between those two, but probably, depending on the capability, also towards the airworthiness side, because depending on the system that goes down on the ship, will impact the capability and the safety of those on board. So while not as rigorous as the safety system supporting aircraft, it's a bit more system dependent on ships, and land's probably at the far end of that spectrum.
Yeah, thanks. No, I appreciate that.
Well, I think that's about it. Unless anyone has any further questions, I'd like to thank everyone for your time. It's been pretty good. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. I hope you've taken some thought provokers to go away and think about, are you doing your own due diligence? How do you do that? And how do you as an individual know when to stop? So thanks everyone. I hope you all enjoyed and have a good night.
No worries. Well, thank you, Nick, for providing that presentation today on due diligence. It's very thorough, and it's the most important process that we go through as engineers on a daily basis, as in the acquisition process and other processes as well. For everybody, we'll do another Learning Together program at the start of next month. And if you just keep ears out to the normal channels, you'll receive information on what that looks like. So thanks again, Nick, from us here at AeroPM. We greatly appreciate your presentation.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Bye.
Thanks, Nick.
Thanks, Nick.